The iron stench of blood clung to the stones, thick as fog, as if the pit itself breathed through its pores. In the training grounds beneath Capua's famed Ludus, where the finest gladiators of the empire were forged in sweat and agony, silence was rare. But this morning, silence had teeth. They gathered at dawn, summoned without warning. Dust clung to bare feet, and chains whispered across the gravel as the slaves filed in Thracians, Gauls, Numidians, and Greeks. All wore the same crude tunic. All bore the same brand on their necks, and all stood in rows, eyes fixed forward, not daring to blink. For in the center of the yard, lashed to a crude X-shaped cross, was a man they all knew. Drusus. His hair matted with blood, his body lashed so deeply the ribs had begun to show through opened skin. Drusus was barely conscious. A flicker of breath escaped his lips, too dry to form sound. His wrists had already turned purple with trapped blood, swollen above the ropes that bit deep into his flesh. Beside him, the Roman guard known only as Lentulus the Butcher prepared his tools: a skinning blade, a curved gut hook, and a jar of salt. Spartacus stood in the front row. He was not shackled. He did not need to be. He had learned the rules: obedience, silence, spectacle. His hands were still smeared from yesterday's training blisters, split and black with grit, but he felt no pain, only heat behind his eyes. Drusus had stolen bread, a crust from the overseer's table, thrown out for the dogs. He had seen a child starving behind the gates and passed it through the bars. That was enough. "He dies for stealing Roman grain," barked Lentulus. "Let his death feed your loyalty." No one moved. Then came the scream. It was not human, not entirely. A wet, rasping howl that echoed off the sandstone walls, rising into the brightening sky like an offering to cruel gods. Lentulus had plunged the hook below the sternum, just beneath the ribs, and begun the long, deliberate pull the unraveling of intestines made into ceremony. The slaves were forced to watch. That was the point. Drusus, somehow, remained conscious. His eyes flitted between faces, searching for something: comfort, maybe, or simply witness. Blood poured from his abdomen, and each breath came shorter, faster, until it became a tremble. Flies circled. A dog whined. Spartacus did not look away. He did not weep. He did not tremble. But beneath his skin, something ancient stirred. Not grief, not fear. Memory. He remembered the forests of Thrace, where his father taught him to read tracks and gut deer with a blade of flint. He remembered the Roman general who came under a banner of alliance, then chained the young warriors after feasting with their elders. He remembered the long march in irons, the auction block in Neapolis, and the first time a Roman called him meat. Drusus had been his only friend, not just a fellow fighter, but a brother in everything except blood. They trained together, bled together, survived together. And now, Drusus was a warning nailed to wood. After the final scream faded into a gurgle, Lentulus stepped back and barked, "Leave him for the birds." They were dismissed. Spartacus didn't move. A centurion shoved him hard. "I said go, Thracian dog." He turned, slowly. The centurion hesitated. There was something wrong in Spartacus's eyes, not rage, but the absence of it. A stillness too deep to be natural. The eyes of a man not planning violence, but waiting for it to grow roots. That night, as the pit dogs licked dried blood from the cross, Spartacus sat beneath the stone archway outside his cell and watched the moon pass overhead. He did not pray, not to the gods of Rome, nor to the gods of Thrace. But he whispered Drusus's name 3 times into the dust and drew a line across the ground with his thumb. The next morning, he volunteered for the harshest drills. When given a chance to rest, he practiced footwork. When others grumbled, he said nothing. When others mourned, he sharpened a spoon into a blade. Weeks passed. The cross remained. No one dared cut it down. Drusus's body dried into a husk, swaying in the Capuan wind. The younger slaves avoided looking. Some whispered of curses. Others crossed themselves when they passed. But Spartacus passed every day, eyes forward. The Romans thought it broke him. It was feeding him. The lanista, Batiatus, noticed the change. The Thracian fights like he's already dead, he murmured to his wife. Perhaps we make a spectacle of him next. But he never did. Because 1 month later, Batiatus would be hanging from his own roof beam, his intestines trailing down like garlands, and Spartacus would be gone, vanished into the hills with 200 freed slaves and the shadow of a friend who still screamed in silence. The rebellion did not begin with a speech. It began with a crucifix and a name whispered into the dust. Before he was a gladiator, before the Roman name Spartacus was carved onto a wax tablet and tied to his worth in silver, he had another name, one not written, only spoken in Thracian tongue, between trees that knew the taste of snow and wolves. He was born under a red moon, or so his mother told him. A hunter's child, his father, a chieftain of a minor Sapaean tribe, had not ruled by bloodline but by reputation, a man who once cracked a Roman helmet with a river stone and kept the dented iron as a charm. His people were horsebound, fire dancing, superstitious, and proud. They feared ghosts more than kings. They buried their dead standing. They believed the soul could be trapped in chains. But Rome came not with ghosts. It came with bribes, roads, and false treaties. Spartacus's first taste of betrayal came not on the battlefield, but at a feast. He was no more than 20, a newly blooded warrior, when the Roman legatus Lucullus arrived under truce. They shared wine. They spoke of joint campaigns against rival tribes. A Roman auxiliary even gifted Spartacus a gladius, claiming it was from Hispania, a warrior's token. That night, the drums played long into the dark. At dawn, the village was in chains. His people didn't resist, not because they were cowards, but because they believed the alliance sacred. That was their undoing. The men were shackled. The women wept. Spartacus watched his father try to bite through his tongue rather than bow to a Roman. They beat him unconscious and dragged him away. Spartacus was sent to serve in the Roman auxiliaries not as a soldier, but a beast of burden. He dug trenches in Thrace for men who mocked his skin, his tongue, and his scent. He slept with a rope around his neck, tethered to his commander's horse cart. When he finally escaped running barefoot across half a province, eating roots, hiding in bogs, he found himself not in freedom, but captured again. This time sold as a fugitive slave in Neapolis. The price 12 denarii, cheaper than a donkey. He was branded on the right shoulder with the mark of fugitivus and outlaw. The flesh never fully healed. It bubbled and colloided, like the bite of a leech. Then came Capua. They said Capua made men legends. that the ludus of Batiatus trained warriors so fierce even Caesar visited to admire them. But it wasn't training. It was starvation, beatings, and humiliation until pain became breath. The first week, Spartacus killed a man in practice, not out of cruelty, just to survive. His reward was a day without water and lashes across the back until skin peeled in strips. His second kill was cleaner. His third was elegant. By the end of the season, they stopped counting. But it was Drusus who taught him how to live between the cracks. Drusus, a former shepherd from the hills outside Venusia, had been enslaved after refusing to betray a runaway cousin. The Romans burned his home and sold his sisters. He laughed when he told the story, not because it was funny, but because laughter was the only part of him the Romans hadn't taken. He taught Spartacus how to loosen manacles with a chicken bone, how to fake a feint to get out of sparring, and how to memorize guard rotations by the squeak of sandals on limestone. More importantly, he taught Spartacus restraint. "You fight like a wolf," he once said in the dark. But even wolves don't snarl unless they see teeth. They shared scraps, bruises, and dreams of escape, the kind spoken only in gesture, never aloud. Drusus once drew a map in the dust beneath their cell with his toe, pointing north, beyond the mountains. He said, "There's no Rome, only forest." Spartacus smiled, but he never answered. He didn't believe in escape. Not then. Not truly. Because Rome was not a prison with walls. It was a hunger in the sky. It fed on names, erasing them. It fed on bones, repurposing them. It fed on men until they forgot they were men. The moment that changed him wasn't in the arena. It was in the holding cell after a fight. He'd won that day easily. Too easily against a nervous boy from Lusitania who barely knew how to grip a sword. When the crowd roared, Spartacus saw none of it. What he saw was Batiatus smiling. Not with joy, but with profit. "That one," he said to the scribes, "worth double now, perhaps even triple if we add chains for show." Spartacus sat in the cell afterward, covered in blood that wasn't his, staring at his hands. These were the same hands that once offered dried meat to a dying horse. The same hands that learned to carve bone flutes for his sisters. Now, they were tools blunt, efficient, broken. Drusus entered, limping from a split shin, and sat beside him. He said nothing, just handed Spartacus a strip of linen for his knuckles. That night, Spartacus dreamed of wolves. But they were caged, their fangs filed, their howls muted. And above them stood Rome, not as a man, but as a machine of iron gears and turning wheels, endless, faceless, feeding on all. He woke with a start. Somewhere beyond the bars, a raven called. He didn't know it yet, but Rome had just made its final mistake. Because you can chain a man, but you cannot chain what festers in silence. And Spartacus had begun to rot. The arena did not smell of blood. Not always. Not first. It smelled of oil, thick and sweet, soaked into the wood of the trapdoors, coating the gears of the elevator platforms that carried beasts to the surface. It smelled of sweat, not from exertion, but from waiting. The kind of sweat that pooled in the hollows of the spine, cold and sour. And beneath it all, barely noticeable, was the scent of old metal rusted shackles, dulled blades, iron helmets polished only on the front, where the crowd could see. Capua's amphitheater was not Rome's Colosseum. It was smaller, coarser, and closer to the breath of its audience. Here, The crowd could smell the fear. The front rows often paid extra to be close enough to be splattered by the arterial bursts of a severed neck or the coughing blood of a pierced lung. And the Romans loved it. Not just the spectacle, but the pattern, the rhythm, the ritual. Morning executions, criminals, deserters, or rebellious slaves stripped, bound, and thrown to beasts. Their screams were not mourned. They were timed, judged, even scored by bored aristocrats tallying death like wine. Midday blood sports, 2 against 2, net and trident versus sword and shield. The crowd picked favorites, not based on skill, but on drama, a stagger, a cry, a sudden reversal. When one fighter dropped to his knees, the people howled for the emperor's thumb. In Capua, it was the local magistrate fat, always drunk, always late. Afternoon, the champions, carefully selected, beautifully scarred, introduced by name, rank, and backstory, many of them fiction. Some even had stage names, like actors. Spartacus, by then, had become one of them. They called him the Thracian Ghost. Not because he screamed he never did, not because he boasted he never spoke, but because he killed quickly, and then knelt. Every time. Kneeling beside the corpse, one hand on the chest, as if listening to the final beat of the heart. The crowd loved him. The trainers hated him. He doesn't smile, one spat. He doesn't salute. He doesn't play. But they couldn't deny his success. Nor could they stop the rumors that he never slept, that his scars healed overnight, that he once fought with a broken rib and didn't flinch. It wasn't true. He did sleep, but in his dreams, the arena never ended. Even when the crowd left, the rituals remained. Spartacus had learned them well. The oiling of the limbs before battle, the sharpening of the blade with a whetstone taken from a murdered Gaul, the clenching of the jaw at the horn's first blast, and above all, the silence. He killed not for cheers, not for survival, not for hate. He killed because the Romans watched. And in their watching, they revealed themselves. To them, death was entertainment. Pain was a privilege, a performance, a currency. But Spartacus saw the truth. The arena was not a punishment. It was a mirror. It reflected the empire as it truly was: brutal, hollow, theatrical. Even the animals played a part. Lions imported from Numidia, their teeth pulled and sharpened with bronze. Tigers painted to appear bloodier than they were. A bear once paraded in golden chains crowned, they said, like a barbarian king. One day, a Nubian slave was ordered to mimic a deer, complete with antlers tied to his skull. He ran on all fours, grunting in fear, while a noble son shot arrows at him from the stands. The boy missed every time until his tutor guided his hand and pierced the man's thigh. The crowd roared with delight. Spartacus was forced to watch. It was educational, they said. And the worst of it, the absolute horror, was not in the deaths, but in how ritual made them sacred. There were rules, ceremonies, expectations. A fighter must die on his back, arms out. A losing gladiator must accept the killing blow without resistance. If a man refused to fall, he was deemed unworthy and slaughtered without honor. No burial, no coin, no record. Once, a German named Rorik wept after slaying a boy half his size. They made him drink wine from the severed head. He choked. They laughed. And yet, amid the cruelty, Some began to see through the veil. Whispers grew among the cells that Spartacus had never asked for freedom, even when offered. That he walked the training yard after dark, tracing symbols in the dust with his toe. That he spoke to birds. Superstition is a powerful thing among the enslaved, and Spartacus did nothing to deny it. He wore the same tunic, never washed. He rubbed ash into his skin before every fight. He never prayed aloud, only stared at the sky with lips slightly parted, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Some began to follow him, quietly, not with pledges, but with behavior. They copied his fighting stance, his breathing rhythm. They began to kneel beside the bodies, too. Drusus noticed. "They think you're more than a man," he warned one night, pressing a poultice to Spartacus's bruised ribs. "That's dangerous." Spartacus didn't respond, because he wasn't trying to be more. He was trying to become nothing, a void into which all Roman cruelty could be poured and vanish. But Rome noticed. The lanista, Batiatus, began selling the more loyal slaves, transferring others, splitting cellmates. He sensed the shift. "Something festers," he told Lentulus the butcher, a windless silence. "That is the silence before rot." He was right, because beneath the rituals, beneath the oil and blood and sand, something was growing. Not hope, not yet, but memory. The memory of betrayal, the memory of wolves, and the memory of a friend left to die in the sun, his bowels steaming in the cold morning air, while the magistrate yawned and sipped wine. The arena had become a church, and Spartacus, its anti-priest, performing sacred rites with each kill, offering not salvation, but vengeance disguised as showmanship. He knew what they did not, that rituals can be reversed, that altars can be flipped, that one day the knives would point the other way, and the screams would rise from Roman throats. It began, as all revolutions do, not with a cry, but with a glance held too long between two men in the training yard, a fleeting silence between the crack of wooden practice swords. In a world where every sound was monitored, every movement weighed, silence became the most dangerous weapon, and so it was in that silence, as blood dried on sand and salt stung the lash wounds on their backs, that the enslaved men of Capua began to see one another, not as tools of Roman pleasure, but as fragments of something long buried, a brotherhood without name, a conspiracy without language. In the weeks following Drusus's execution, the ludus changed, subtly at first. The usual groans of pain during sparring sessions grew quieter, more deliberate, as if even agony required discipline now. Men began volunteering for punishment detail not out of obedience, but to study the guards' routines. Water-bearers traced the rhythm of patrols with their footsteps. Those tasked with cleaning the latrines returned with more than waste on their hands: fragments of iron, a rusted hinge, a stone sharp enough to scar flesh. Spartacus said little. That, too, was part of the ritual now. He had become not a leader, but a gravity, a center of silence around which others began to orbit. His presence in the barracks drew men to speak in riddles, in symbols. He'd sit beside a Gallic brawler and tap 3 fingers against the floor. No explanation followed. Yet the next morning, that same man would limp a little less and practice with more intention, sharpening not just his blade, but his gaze. The Romans took this as fatigue. They thought the men were finally breaking. The lanista began to joke again. Lentulus drank more during evening drills. Even the magistrate, bloated and bored, began planning a festival bout to celebrate the Saturnalia, a grand display of executions and blood sport for the Capuan elite. He wanted Spartacus to fight a Nubian giant in chained combat, half naked and smeared with ceremonial paint. A feast for the gods, he slurred, and the people. But below the sand, the feast was already being prepared not with wine and oil, but with stolen nails and kitchen knives dulled by bone. The first weapon came from the woman who cleaned the Lanista's study. Her name was Melia, once a midwife in Delos. Her wrists bore the faded rope marks of a woman sold 3 times over. She spoke only when necessary, her face hidden beneath a veil of ash and linen. But she watched everything. One day, she left a note under Spartacus's ration bowl. It was written in soot on pigskin. One word cellar. That night, Spartacus pried open a loose floor tile beneath the storage room. Beneath it, buried in old straw and rat droppings, was a cache, 3 broken swords, an axe head without a shaft, a dozen nails bent into points, and a torch wrapped in lambskin. He didn't smile, he didn't speak. He simply covered the hole again and began counting the hours. Soon, others brought what they could, a spoon filed into a spike, a wine jug filled with animal fat, a pair of sandals stitched with sharpened bronze in the soles. Each gift passed in silence, through nods or taps or shared gazes across the dinner line. Even the cook, a sour-faced ex-soldier named Cinna, began leaving scraps of meat that were too generous, too frequent, pretending not to see when hands reached into forbidden baskets. Still, it was not enough. They needed more. And so came the pact. It was not formal. There was no oath, no blood rite, no night under stars where voices declared rebellion in the old heroic way. That was myth. Reality was slower, messier. The pact was made in fragments: a Gaul who chose not to report a hidden blade, a Numidian who opened a gate 2 seconds too early, a Celt who threw a fight to mask the passing of a map. Each act small, each silence louder. They gathered, rarely and briefly, in the abandoned baths once used to soothe the aching muscles of prized fighters, now left to ruin. There, beneath crumbling mosaic ceilings and broken marble lions, they stood in a circle, saying nothing. Spartacus would look at each man in turn, as if reading scripture written on skin. Then he would kneel and draw a line in the dust, always the same line from west to east, ending in a cross. One night, a young Syrian slave named Abbas, no more than 16, his face still too soft for such a place, asked him quietly, "Is that the path to freedom?" Spartacus looked at him, long and slow, and answered, "No." "Then what is it?" "The path to their gods." He said nothing more. Abbas did not ask again. But that answer, cryptic as it was, began to spread. Because the slaves did not believe in freedom, not truly. That dream had been worn thin by years of lashes, years of sold children and raped wives and broken teeth hidden behind smiles. Freedom was a word Rome used as bait, not gift. But revenge was real. Revenge had weight. It bled. It screamed. And revenge could be planned. So they began rehearsing death. When guards ordered practice bouts, they staged accidents falls that ended with a dislocated joint, or a sword dropped conveniently near a friendly foot. The guards laughed, thinking themselves clever. They mocked the clumsy dogs, never realizing how well the dogs had learned to fall. The rebels counted their allies carefully. 25 at first, then 38. By the third week, nearly 50. Still not enough. They needed one more thing. They needed chaos. It came in the form of a feast. The magistrate's Saturnalia banquet was scheduled for the week of the winter solstice, a grotesque affair of roasted oxen, caged leopards, dancing girls, and theatrical executions. For the centerpiece, a staged duel between Spartacus and a blind German slave named Ulrich, in chains, with real blades. The crowd would choose who lived. What they didn't know was that Ulrich wasn't blind. He had been faking it for over a year, hiding the truth behind milk-clouded contact lenses made from polished quartz. He could see shapes, movement, enough, and he had sworn to die only on his feet. When Spartacus heard of the match, he requested a change. "Let us fight in the cellar first," he said, "to warm the limbs. It is tradition in Thrace." The lanista, too drunk to care, approved it. That was the crack. The fight would not take place in the arena. It would begin in the bowels of the house, among barrels of oil, near the servants' entrance, where guards rotated lazily and the floor sloped toward the western gate. They had a plan. Ulrich would swing wide. Spartacus would dodge left. A fake fall, a torch thrown, a scream staged, and then knives. Not many, not sharp, but enough. The real war would not be fought in the arena, but in the 5 seconds before the first guard could draw breath to shout. In that breath, they would kill or be killed. The day arrived cold and gray. The guests arrived in furs, drunk on winter wine. Slaves lit torches in every corridor. The lanista wore red robes and a golden laurel. In the kitchens, Melia passed a jug of poisoned broth to Cinna. In the cellars, Ulrich unwrapped the linen around his blind eyes and blinked into the gloom. Spartacus stood at the center, barefoot, chest bare, eyes closed. He said nothing. He knelt and drew the line in the dust, west to east, ending in a cross. The pact had become prophecy. It was not a scream that began the revolt, but the sound of shattering clay, a wine jug hurled against a limestone pillar, exploding in a burst of fire as the oil within caught the torchlight and ignited the cellar in a sudden, hungry bloom of orange and black. For one stunned second, the Roman guards near the stairs merely blinked, too drunk or too arrogant to understand what was happening. By the time one of them opened his mouth to shout, his throat was already spilling dark. Arterial blood from a sharpened chicken bone plunged through the soft gap beneath his jaw. The other turned, sword half drawn, but found himself face to face with Spartacus, not the quiet, kneeling slave of the arena, not the obedient beast who bowed before crowds, but something older, something feral. His body coated in ash and oil, his eyes reflecting the firelight as if they were carved from bronze. The Roman tried to step back, but Spartacus didn't let him. He moved with purpose, no flair. No rage, only the clinical efficiency of a man who had practiced this moment 1,000 times in silence. The shiv entered the soldier's ribs, twisted once, and was withdrawn. The Roman dropped. Then the silence shattered. The cellar erupted into motion. Ulrich lunged toward the door, shoulder slamming it shut and jamming the latch with the broken shaft of a broom. Abbas was already at the oil barrels, toppling them with practiced swings of a hammer stolen weeks earlier. Flames leapt to the splashing puddles, licking the walls. From behind a stack of amphorae, Cinna emerged with a torch and a meat cleaver, his face streaked with soot and sweat, eyes wide with the terror of a man who had just realized he was no longer pretending. "We're in it now," he gasped. Not to Spartacus, but to the gods, or perhaps to the ghosts of those who had watched him serve Roman masters for 20 years. There was no answer, only fire. In the barracks above, the flames brought chaos. The thick stone walls of the ludus channeled smoke upward, not outward. The corridors filled with black haze before anyone could locate the source. Slaves ran not to escape, but to obey. Trained instinct overrode fear, and many moved toward their posts, only to be tripped, stabbed, or strangled by hands they'd once shared meals with. It was swift, it was brutal, and it was necessary. The first guard post fell within minutes. Spartacus had timed it for the changing of the shifts. Half of the men were drunk. The others had already removed their armor to eat. Only Lentulus remained at full readiness, and he was in the bathhouse naked, humming a Macedonian war tune, unaware that 2 of his favorite fighters were already dead, and the Lanista's throat was being cut open by a Gaul with hands too large for a sword hilt. Melia found him first. She did not scream. She stood in the bathhouse doorway, hair matted with sweat, face smeared with soot and blood that was not hers. Lentulus stood, soap still on his arms, and reached for a blade on the wall. He never made it. From behind, a boy no older than 14, a stable hand no one had ever noticed, drove a pitchfork into the back of his knees. Lentulus collapsed. Melia moved quickly, kneeling beside him, whispering something into his ear. No one heard what she said, but when her blade entered the soft flesh beneath his chin, she wept. Above, the Roman guests screamed. They had come for spectacle, and they received it, but not the kind they expected. The arena, decorated in garlands and incense, filled not with music, but with the shrill cries of dying men. Flames leapt from the gallery roof. 2 leopards broke loose from their cages, one mauling a senator before being speared by a slave wearing the skin of a bear. The nobles fled toward the city gates, only to find them locked, the mechanism jammed with a splintered wagon wheel and a crucifix torn from the outer wall. The slaves made no declarations, no banners were raised, no horns were sounded. But by midnight, Capua's ludus was no longer Roman. It was silent. The bodies were gathered and stacked in the courtyard. The slaves did not cheer. They buried their dead first wrapped in torn linens, blessed in dozens of languages. Some prayed. Others stood with heads bowed, waiting. Spartacus said nothing. He knelt once more, not to mark the ground, but to press his palm into the blood-slicked dust, as if to remind the earth that it had tasted vengeance. And yet it had only begun. The next morning, they moved. 200 strong. Not all were fighters. Some were wounded. Some were cooks, grooms, stable boys, women too old to lift a blade. But they marched together into the countryside, into the hills, away from the roads where Rome's legions might follow quickly. They knew this would not go unnoticed. Rome never ignored blood. But they did not run. They prepared. Spartacus split them into groups, drilled them, taught them formations he remembered from Roman auxiliaries: wedge, crescent, shield wall. They fashioned weapons from plowshares and fire pokers. They boiled pitch. They stole boots from corpses and armor from abandoned carts. A blacksmith, once enslaved in Sicily, fashioned spears from gateposts and arrowheads from snapped hinges. A woman from Gaul taught them to set traps in the underbrush. Every day, their numbers grew. Peasants fed them. Local slaves fled to join them. even freedmen, once proud of their Roman titles, began to whisper, "This man fights not for a flag, but for memory." Still, Spartacus said little. He led from the front, never retreating, never boasting. At night, he sat alone, carving symbols into wood with the same iron nail used to kill his first guard. One symbol always returned a line from west to east, ending in a cross. They asked him once what it meant. He answered, "It is the path to where their gods sleep, and we are the noise that wakes them." Rome did wake. News of the revolt reached the Senate within a week. They laughed. One magistrate called it a blister. Another referred to it as a local mess of kitchen knives and slave tears. A small force was dispatched, 200 men, poorly armed, barely trained. They were found 3 days later, crucified along the road to Capua. No slave was found near the scene, only a single message scrawled on the bark of an olive tree for Drusus. The name meant nothing to the senators, but it meant everything to Spartacus, because the site chosen for the crucifixion was no accident. It was the same road, the same tree line, the same rising sun that had once lit the face of his dearest friend as he was torn open like a sack of grain before a silent crowd. The revolt had not been born of justice, nor of politics, nor of philosophy. It had been born of a cross, not the Roman cross that represented power, empire, or law, but the cross of punishment, the silent X upon which a man was bled dry for giving bread to a child. Now Rome would learn, not through treaties or warnings, but through ash and through cellar doors torn from hinges. Spartacus kept the nail he'd used, wore it around his neck. The others did the same, not as a symbol of faith, but as a memory carved in iron. For them, faith had long ago been burnt away. What remained was vengeance tempered into discipline, pain hammered into purpose. They moved again, toward Vesuvius. The mountain loomed ahead, a jagged mouth against the sky, its slopes steep, its caverns deep. The Romans would not follow there, not yet. They feared the terrain, the weather, the rumors of bandits and ghosts. Spartacus chose it not for superstition, but for time. Time to teach, time to build, time to remember. On the eve of their first winter in hiding, they built a pyre of stolen Roman armor. It was not for the dead they had already buried their own in cairns and tree hollows. It was for memory. Spartacus stood before it, torch in hand. "This is not the last fire," he said. And for the first time since Capua, he smiled. Then he dropped the torch. The flames caught quickly, rising into the sky like the roar of the arena. But this time, it was Rome that trembled, weathered by sun and storm, stripped of its ropes by scavenging birds, blackened by time and the soot of distant fires. The crucifix on the road outside Capua had not been torn down. The Romans had left it standing out of negligence or superstition, or perhaps because no one had dared approach it since that day when the blood of a slave had soaked its base and his intestines had curled like serpents across the sand. It stood as a relic of Rome's pride, but to Spartacus, it had become something else entirely, not a warning, but a wound that refused to close. He returned to it once, alone, under the cover of a moonless sky. It was not a pilgrimage. It was not even grief. It was remembrance, the kind that binds itself not to sorrow, but to rage made holy by time. He stood before the wooden beams, taller now in memory than they had been in life, and pressed his hand to the rough grain where Drusus's back had once thrashed. He did not cry. He did not kneel. He whispered only 2 words. "We begin." The fire of revolt, first lit in the cellar of Capua, had become a furnace by the time the Roman Senate accepted that this was no mere skirmish of disobedient slaves. Towns had fallen, villas had been emptied, Roman outposts, once considered invincible, had burned with their gates wide open and their commanders impaled on their own banners. Spartacus did not march like a barbarian. He maneuvered like a tactician harassing supply lines, ambushing convoys, and liberating every slave compound he encountered with swift, merciless precision. His army grew by the hundreds with every campaign, swelling into a roaring tide of the dispossessed Thracians, Gauls, Celts, Ethiopians, Syrians. Former legionaries turned renegade, women who had watched their children die in chains and now sharpened their vengeance into spear tips. But it was not chaos, not under him. Each camp was organized with almost obsessive order. Rations were shared, spoils redistributed with discipline, guards rotated with Roman precision, every man trained, every child hidden, every night. The silence of drills echoed in the valleys, spears clashing like distant thunder, shields rising in synchrony. This was no mob. This was a reckoning. And yet, for all their growing power, Spartacus refused one thing: the crown. He was offered it more than once, a circle of woven gold looted from a noble's corpse, a carved diadem from a captured governor. But each time, he rejected it with the same gesture, pressing it into the ground beside a fresh grave. "I am no king," he said. "I am memory." For Spartacus understood something the Romans never could: a king dies. A memory spreads. His enemies, for their part, grew desperate. Rome sent not 1, but 4 legions. The first was ambushed and destroyed in the foothills of Lucania, its general decapitated and his body left naked, draped across a war horse and returned to the Senate gates as a message. The second was lured into a gorge near Petelia and burned alive when Spartacus's men set the forests ablaze and drove them into the flames with horn blasts and hails of arrows. The third retreated before engagement, its commander claiming logistical difficulty, and promptly fell on his sword rather than face trial for cowardice. Only the fourth, led by Marcus Licinius Crassus, proved a true threat. Crassus did not seek glory. He sought order. A banker by trade, he saw rebellion not as heresy or tragedy, but as a deficit to be corrected. His first act as general was to reinstate decimatio, the ancient punishment whereby every 10th man in a failing cohort was executed by his fellow soldiers. Discipline returned. Fear returned. And with it, the tide began to shift. Spartacus knew he could not defeat Rome forever, not in open war, not on Roman soil. He proposed a retreat across the Alps, into Gaul, into lands where Rome's reach faltered. His lieutenants, blood-drunk and hopeful, disagreed. They wanted Rome's heart. They wanted the Senate to burn. But Spartacus, who had once watched his friend torn open on Roman orders, knew what the price would be. He saw the future not in prophecy, but in strategy, and it bled red. Still, he remained. Not for conquest. For closure, he returned to Capua one final time. Not as a slave, not as a gladiator, but as a specter, the Thracian ghost reborn. The city had already emptied in fear. Those who remained were dragged into the square, made to look upon the cross that still stood. They were not harmed. They were not mocked. They were only forced to listen. "Here," Spartacus said, "they killed a man for feeding a child." He did not say Drusus's name. He did not have to. He ordered the cross burned, not broken, burned as a signal to the gods and to history. The fire took quickly, spitting cinders into the gray morning air. The people wept, not for the dead, for what the fire meant. And then he left, leaving behind not destruction, but silence. But Crassus was closing in. The final campaign began in the winter of 71 BCE. Bitter, rain-drenched, mud-choked, Spartacus's forces, now numbering in the tens of thousands, found themselves trapped between Crassus's legions and the sea. Escape by ship failed, their Sicilian allies betrayed them. Supplies dwindled, morale frayed. Still, Spartacus fought. He broke through the siege line once, carving a path with his own hands, sword in one, shield in the other. His body drenched in the blood of 6 Roman officers slain personally in a single assault. He offered one final retreat to his men. Many stayed. Many chose to die beside him. On the morning of the last battle, the battle of the Salarius River, Spartacus stood before his army, no longer in rags, but in the armor of a Roman general stripped from a body he had buried with his own hands. He bore no insignia, no crest, only the nail rusted and black still tied around his neck by a cord of leather. He raised it once. "This is the only crown I need," he said. And then they charged. The field became a slaughterhouse. The rebels fought not for victory, but for remembrance, and in doing so, made themselves immortal. Spartacus was seen at the center, cutting through Roman lines like a firestorm, his blade broken halfway through the fight, switching to a spear, then to a Roman gladius taken from a corpse. He fell once, rose again, fell twice, bleeding heavily. Still he rose. When he finally disappeared beneath a crush of soldiers, the Romans could not even find his body. It was never identified. No monument marks the place, only rumors of a figure seen walking the battlefield after nightfall, barefoot, dragging a bloodied sword through the mud, whispering a name lost to time. Drusus. And so the memory endured. Rome crucified 6,000 survivors along the Appian Way, a line of bodies stretching over 100 miles. They called it justice, but they did not burn the cross in Capua. They rebuilt it. It still stands today. And some say that on nights when the wind howls through the stones and the moon casts its cold light upon the beam, one can see a shadow not hung, but standing before it. A man without crown or name, only memory, only silence, only the beginning of the noise that would one day shake empires. And so he passed not in flame, not in triumph, but in absence. No tomb, no relic, no scripture records his last breath. Rome buried his story beneath its monuments and its coins, beneath centuries of silence and shame. Yet silence, like fire, spreads, and memory, when wrapped in chains, grows teeth. Beneath the frost-bitten stones of Capua, beneath the dry dust of the arena where so many screamed, something still pulses. A scar, a whisper, a name not erased, but worn smooth by repetition, like a prayer carved into wood. Not a king, not a god, only a man who remembered what was done to his friend and taught the world to kneel before no cross that was not of their own choosing. When the wind moves across the Appian Way, rattling the bones of the unmarked dead, listen closely. You may still hear him,